الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستنصره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهد الله فلا مضل له وما يضلله فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، يقول الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ما قطعتم من لينة أو تركتموهما قائمة على أصولها فبإذن الله وليخزي الفاسقين. بسم الله. At the outset, I offer a disclosure. I am only a student. Anything that I say should be taken with a grain of salt. They are my own observations and my own understandings. Whether they are correct or incorrect, I leave for you and for God to judge. I'm only here as I was tasked with making sure that this pulpit does not collect dust, for the simple fact that our teacher, Dr. Khalid Abu Fadl, had a prior engagement. And given the exigent circumstances of our children being killed, it was decided that it was better not to cede this space instead of other pulpits to uphold the Islamic message and the Islamic ethic. And we know that that is what this pulpit is for. In Surah Al-Jum'ah it says at the very end, وَإِذَا رَأَوْا تِجَارَةً أَوْ لَهْوًا انفضوا إِلَيْهَا وَتَرَكُوكَ قَائِمًا. In the beautiful Surah Al-Jum'ah, the story goes, the narrative goes, that the Muslims and the Medinans of the time were under significant financial pressure. And during a khutbah, during a sermon, a significant amount of the Muslims stood up and left the sermon as they heard their commercial interests ringing, as there was a convoy of merchants who were bringing things that were needed to a very difficult moment for the society. And they went to purchase the things that they needed for their families. And it left the Muslims to receive this ayah, a very beautiful ayah. And it's an ayah that belongs to a set of surahs called the Musabbihat, which teach a great many things, and they're very closely interlinked and interwoven with one another. In Surah Al-Jum'ah, it uses the word tarakuka, well, the phrase rather, tarakuka qa'iman, to leave you standing, if we were to try to make a literal translation. To leave the Prophet standing alone on the podium, as he did what? The beginning of Surah Al-Jum'ah begins with essentially an outline of what the Prophet is here to do for his community. He was there to purify them, to teach them the book, being the Quran, and to teach them hikmah, to teach them wisdom. And it ends, and you leave him standing. وَتَرَكُوكَ قَائِمًا. Those two words rang in my head for probably a year and a half. Who do we leave standing in our lives? And who was the individual that was left standing at that pulpit? What was he doing at that pulpit? That is the great question that has been asked for 14 centuries. What was he doing? Tarakuka qa'iman. Standing, establishing, iqamat as-salah, to establish salah. At that pulpit, he was teaching morality. At that pulpit, he was teaching moral discernment. At that pulpit, he was teaching how to think. At that pulpit, he was teaching how to respond under dire circumstances. With fear, a response to fear being aggression and anger and hostility, or was the response a well thought out moral trajectory? Those words, tarakuka qa'iman, rang in my head a great amount. So much so that as I read some of these other surahs, like in Surah Al-Hashr, I was struck by a very similar phrasing that at my research didn't avail itself in any other part of the Quran, as far as I know. ما قطعتم من لينة أو تركتهما قائما على أصولها. This verse in Surah Al-Hashr refers to a very interesting incident that I will summarize very basically. The verse itself reads, "Whatsoever palm trees you cut down or left standing on their roots, it was by God's leave, in order that he might confound the evil doers." It uses again that same phrase, "Taraktuhuma qa'iman," rather than "tarakuka qa'iman," left you standing, left them standing, and with the addition, upon their roots, or if you read it differently, upon their principles. The story of Surah Al-Hashr is of significant importance. I don't wish to get into the details. If you want to know them, you should refer yourself to the Tafsir, Project Illumin. There are 2 episodes or 2 halaqat that describe in detail the historical background. But in quick summary, it talks about the ordeal that the Muslims had with the Jewish tribe of Banu Nadir. Banu Nadir was one of the Jewish tribes that had signed the initial peace treaty with the non-aggression treaty with Muslims in Medina that allowed for the Muslims to live in relative safety in their immediate society, safe enough away from the Quraysh, who they were in open combat and hostility with. For many different reasons, Banu Nadir broke this treaty, the terms of this treaty. And they began relations with the Quraysh, who were, of course, the enemies of the Muslims in Mecca. And they were willing to essentially be a satellite group that would oppose the Muslims on behalf of the Quraysh, or in terms of going back on a treaty and making a treaty with the enemy that supposedly everyone was supposed to be protecting each other from. It was treachery and deception. And it left the Muslims with a very difficult choice. Well, rather, no choice. And the choice was to offer Banu Nadir the ability to leave on exile, to leave those lands, to secure at least the Medinan polity. And they allowed for Banu Nadir to return yearly on the harvest to take the harvest, and specifically of their prized palm trees. Of course, palm trees are prized commodities because they produce dates in Arabia, which were very beloved to the Arabs at the time, and still are. Banu Nadir obviously liked those terms, but they felt that they were able to withstand the pressure of the Muslims, and thought that the Quraysh and particular other elements would come to the rescue should it come to a war scenario in terms of a military conflict between the Muslims and Banu Nadir. So they refused. And that is when the siege began. The Muslims laid their first siege on the castles of Banu Nadir. But there was a very interesting predicament. The predicament was, not only did Banu Nadir have the tactical safety of being behind brick walls, seemingly impenetrable, but they also had a very interesting shield in front of their fortress, and that was the palm trees. A significant amount of palm trees were blocking the way in such a way that Banu Nadir could strike the Muslims from their position, but the Muslims had a very difficult time striking back, which led to a major ethical dilemma amongst the Muslim soldiers, anyone who was involved in the siege. Do we cut down these trees in order to better access for military strategy? Or is this unethical to destroy trees in the process of gaining military expediency or pragmatism or whatever have you in this conflict? It caused quite a stir. Now, in the halaqas, if you follow them, there is a question mark whether or not the Jews of the tribe of Banu Nadir did actually say this or not. But let's assume that they did. And what would it communicate? And it is the following. Banu Nadir calls from the fortress down to the Muslims and says to them, "Oh, so you're the Muslims that we heard about. You are the peace-loving prophet that we've heard about, who comes to war and cuts down our beloved palm trees. I thinking, again, we just mentioned that palm trees were of particular significance in Arabia during that time and were beloved to all Arabs and to all within that region. And their fruits, their dates, were extremely relied upon, especially in times of war and difficulty. Why did they do that? Why did they call down to the Muslims and say, "Oh, moral army, oh, moral group, led by the most moral prophet or leader, whomever you may be, you choose more violence to destroy and cut down"? See, this is an example of who you really are. You are destructive. You're not here because you think that you're on a moral mission. You're here to destroy. This is how we can summarize you. You are destroyers. Ever since you've come here, you've destroyed. And this is a crown example of your actual intentions: destruction, pain. An interesting allegation to be leveled from a group who excel in treachery, who went back on their word, who we know in another surah, Surah As-Saf, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that which is most disgusting to him are those who say something and go back on their word and do something else. There is nothing more disgusting. And God then goes back immediately after that verse and says the opposite of that are those who are as if an impenetrable saf, line of ranks, as if impenetrable, and they fight or strive in God's way together in a unanimous moral cause and structure way. Again, as stated in the halaqas, it would not make sense for all times to fight in a structure in which everyone is standing close together in one particular place, where we have F-16s and someone can just bomb and move on. There is a metaphorical moral point in Surah As-Saf, as there is a connected metaphorical moral point in Surah Al-Hashr, and they are connected with the other musabbihat, the surahs, the 5 surahs. The moral point is as such. The Muslims were concerned before the Banu Nadir decided to bring up the point of the moral dilemma. They were the ones that were talking amongst each other. What is worth it? What are the extents that we're willing to go? We wish sincerely to serve God, to serve justice, to serve righteousness, to secure the safety of our polity. But at what cost? Are we willing to risk our humanity and our position as potentially being aspiring agents of God, deputies of God on earth? See, a person that is concerned about being a deputy for justice and righteousness constantly questions and engages in moral inventory to see if they are rising to the challenge to be allowed to consider themselves possibly as deputies and agents, not assuming that this is simply given to you. Surah Al-Hadid ends with a very interesting verse. It says, لِأَلَّمَ يَعْلَمُ أَهْلُ الْكِتَابِ أَنْ لَا يَقْدِرُونَ عَلَى شَيْءٍ مِّن فَضْلِ اللَّهِ وَيُؤْتِيهِمْ وَأَنَّ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ مِنْ لئلا يعلم أهل الكتاب أن لا يقدرون على شيء من فضل الله I'm forgetting the end of the verse, but the point of the verse is that God's favor belongs to God. God's favor is earned. And God wants you to know God wants you to know that it is not simply inherited, it is not simply given by some sort of randomness. It is earned, and it is earned by its moral quality. It is not given because you're simply chosen. The Muslims made the difficult decision. They cut down 6 palm trees out of a field of palm trees. Some lay standing, stayed standing on their roots, as the verse says, and some were cut down. تَرَكْتُهُمَا قَائِمَةً عَلَى أُصُولِهَا. What is the usul? What is the principle that was derived from this verse? Many legalists and jurists came to the conclusion that these are the laws of war, that you ought to be careful to not cut down trees and not kill innocent civilians, avoid collateral damage, etc., etc., etc. But there is a further moral point here. The further moral point is whatever the decision is that you come to in these difficult circumstances, if you have been careful and routinely diligent about what it is that you are trying to accomplish, about genuinely searching for what is God's will in this particular set of circumstances, then the decision that you make is less important than the methodology of due diligence which you have applied to these difficult circumstances. You cut down the tree, you don't cut down the tree. Whether you do or you don't, it is part of God's plan in order to develop the moral mind of the one who is submitted to justice, to God's justice, to equity, so that in the future, the jurists ultimately come to the correct conclusion. وَتَرَكْتُهُمَا قَائِمَةً عَلَى أُصُولِهَا. I find it very interesting that the field of jurisprudence is usul al-fiqh. There is a principle here, and the principle the jurists ultimately got right. You leave the tree standing if you can. And if they are not there, then you do not simply just repeat, well, it says here in a X book that you mechanically leave the trees or you mechanically cut down the trees. And so I'm not going to think about it, and I will just simply cut and I will move forward. I won't apply any juhd. I will not strive to be able to get the right answer. That is the wrong answer. Moral expediency is not allowed. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. In the last 60 days or so, we have been aware of a great amount of difficulty, strife, sadness, loss of life, destruction, loss of homes, food insecurity, safety, emotional damage, trauma of all kinds. And there is something very interesting that we have seen from the rhetoric that has been published and propagated by the United States and by the State of Israel, particularly in these last 60 days, but it is something that is done routinely. We are at a juncture in which those people who are fair-minded are actually seriously considering whether law means anything at all anymore. Forget about international law. Does law mean anything anymore? Does morality mean anything anymore? It feels that morality is more of a weapon feels more that law is a weapon rather than a regulatory factor of inhibition that would prevent our worst selves from manifesting. I invite you to consider a few different palm trees that I believe that the United States and Israel, as examples, have been planting in front of their fortress. Yes, their fortresses are very strong. The United States is separated by oceans from their enemies. They have secured Mexico and Canada. There is no immediate threat to the nation of the United States. And on a smaller scale, Israel has the same. They have built walls, they have built checkpoints, they have built towers, they have F-16 guided missiles, they have guns, they have billions of dollars that go into the spin machine, and billions of dollars that go into their Iron Dome, and billions of dollars that go towards their military training against a fairly defenseless people. But what are the palm trees that they have planted in between their fortresses and their enemies? The first palm tree to consider. Here's a report from the Times of Israel. There are reports emerging from a meeting of the family members of hostages, including recently freed captives, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of the war cabinet, that indicate the gathering is markedly tense and hostile, and that some families have left early. Several Hebrew media reports quote that Netanyahu was telling the families, quote, "There is no possibility right now to bring everyone home," referring to the hostages or the prisoners of war in Gaza. Can anyone really imagine that if that was an option, anyone would refuse it? This statement was met with anger from many. بَأْسُهُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ شَدِيد. There's much conflict between them in Surah Hashr, it says. You consider them unified. You think that they are one, unified in their moral reality. But what you don't know is behind closed doors, behind their fortresses, they are fighting amongst themselves because they don't trust each other. And for very good reason, they don't trust each other. The next palm tree. Fear Hamas. Hamas is liable for any and all deaths. Haaretz, there is an article in Haaretz that says, a freed Israeli woman emphasized concern for the remaining captives' lives. She said, quote, "What I see on TV scares me a lot. I see bombings there, and you have no idea where the captives are. I was in a house surrounded by explosions. We slept in tunnels, and we feared not Hamas, but Israel might kill us." She said, "We feared not Hamas, but Israel might kill us. And then it would have been said, Hamas killed you." That is extremely interesting and telling. She has already correctly anticipated the spin machine of deception. What is the palm tree? It is an amazing spin that has been placed, and I want to make this very clear. There is no illusion between the fact that Banu Nadir was a Jewish tribe and that Israel are Jews. There's no connection. The only connection is the absolute submission to the concept of deceit as a response to fear, instead of applying moral precepts and a moral response to fear. They respond with deception. And that deception is being displayed on full blast to the members that they are supposedly protecting of their tribe, so to speak, and to the rest of the world. How about another one? The palm tree of the Mizrahi Jews. This is an old palm tree that Israel has hid behind for many, many years. whenever someone levels the accusation of cultural theft towards Israel, they point and they say, Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi Jews are Jews that were living in Arab lands, particularly Yemen and Iran and Syria and these types of places, and significantly Yemen. So when we eat hummus and when we eat khoresh sabzi, or when we eat some other, Iranian or Yemeni or something other dish, this isn't cultural theft. This is just what we eat. We're from this region. Well, there's a very interesting article and book. The article talks about this book. It is an autobiography detailing the life of the Israeli historian who was an Iraqi Jew. His name is Avi Shleim, who writes that he uncovered, quote, incontrovertible evidence of Zionist underground involvement in bombings that were in Iraq that prompted a mass exodus of Jews from Iraq between 1950 and 1951. Those Iraqi Jews were, of course, relocated to Israel. The bombings at the time included attacks on a coffee shop, a car dealership, a synagogue, among other attacks on Jewish communities and businesses. 3 of those attacks on Jewish sites, upon the orders of Mayor Max Binneth, an Israeli intelligence officer who supplied a Zionist intelligence operative, Yusuf Basri, with grenades and TNT explosives. As well as weapons, Binneth allegedly provided Basri with maps, intelligence, and instructions, which included an order, and I quote, to terrorize and not to kill. The Israeli officials, of course, have long rejected any Zionist underground or official Israeli involvement, and they instead blame them on Iraqi nationalists. It is the same play over and over again. You do in secret what you know is wrong, and you blame it on the polity that didn't do anything at all. And then you use them. Furthermore, on Mizrahi Jews, Haaretz reports, in the years immediately following Israel's establishment, primarily from 1948 to 1954, more than 1,000 babies born to Yemenite immigrant families disappeared. According to a large number of accounts, the children disappeared either immediately after birth or after being hospitalized due to illness. Some of the families were told that their children had died, but they were not shown a body and did not receive a death certificate nor information on the burial. In 2017, the state archives made hundreds of thousands of relevant documents accessible to the public. Although they contain damning accounts of official conduct, they did not find evidence of an institutionalized plan to abduct children. Following the disclosure of the documents, the Knesset convened a special committee to investigate the affair. The committee found widespread negligence, racist and remiss conduct on the part of officials, and carelessness in recording the details of hospitalized children, which in some cases led to their adoption without the knowledge or consent of the biological parents. These are the same Mizrahi Jews that Israel likes to prop up as a palm tree to gain moral cover when they steal and plunder the lands of Palestine, including its culture. Another palm tree, international law and the moderation of violence. Here's what Blinken says on December 6. I have determined members of the Sudanese armed forces have committed war crimes, and the Rapid Support Forces have committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing in Sudan. We stand with the people of Sudan in their demands for peace and civil democratic rule. Count the amount of palm trees that he has planted in one statement. War crimes again, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, stand with the people, civilian democratic rule. That is only 100 words or less. Somehow he has incredible moral clarity when it comes to this circumstance. But in the matter of Israel and Palestine, it's all debatable. Well, they are doing all that they can to abide by international law. We are putting pressure on them. We need to limit and be moderate about the amount of damage that we are doing They're doing their best. We are in their ear. Don't worry, we're telling them. Don't forget international law, very important. I want to play a few clips that are very interesting. Here's the first clip, is from Hillary Clinton.
As you well know, many women and girls were attacked brutally by Hamas on October 7th, and they have testified to the gender-based violence that they both experienced and witnessed. As a global community, we must respond to weaponized sexual violence wherever it happens with absolute condemnation. There can be no justifications and no excuses. Rape as a weapon of war is a crime against humanity. Such atrocities have no place in any society or any conflict. It is outrageous.
Pay very close attention to the language that she used, and listen to this clip of the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, who discusses these ongoing conversations with Israel about the reports of rape and sexual violence.
Negotiate with the terrorist group. The truce between Israel and Hamas has collapsed, but there are still about 130 hostages, that, including 8 Americans. What is happening behind the scenes to get negotiations back on track, and how do you negotiate with a terrorist group that is reportedly engaging in brutal rape, sexual violence, and warns that October 7th was just the beginning?
So much there in that question, and you're correct. We have to remember what happened on October 7th. October 7th, we saw a terrorist organization, Hamas, brutalize, slaughter innocent people. That's what we saw. And what Israel has been...
There were rapes also.
There were rapes, as you just laid out. There were rapes, and I want to be very clear on this. Rape is reprehensible. Yeah. And when you use rape as a form of a weapon of war, that's reprehensible, and we have called that out.
It's an international law crime.
Exactly, right? And that is, we have to call that out, and that is something that the president and we all will continue to do. And so, look, as you just said, the humanitarian pause has ended. We're having conversations with Israel. We're having conversations with Egypt and others in the region to continue that conversation. But really, the group or organization that is stopping that is Hamas. Because as you're asking me about the rape and the brutalization of women, one of the things that Israel has asked for is for a list of these women who are being held hostage. And they are not going to give up. Israel's not going to give up on these women. And so,
and their babies, 3-year-old, a 3-month-old baby was
and Hamas
kidnapped.
is refusing to provide that list. And so, therefore, the humanitarian pause has paused. But we want that to continue because what has happened with that humanitarian pause that lasted for a couple of days is that we were able to bring almost 100 hostages home back to their families and to their loved ones, and also continue that humanitarian aid that the people in Gaza truly need. One of the things, too, that I want people to understand and know is that even though the humanitarian pause is stopped for the moment, Israel has continued to bring in or get in humanitarian aid, which is really important, at the same level during the humanitarian pause. So that is important for folks to note, but we want to go back into having that pause.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Could you count the number of moral palm trees in which they planted to give themselves cover, to allow, ultimately what they're saying is, we're allowed to keep bombing them. And here's why. It's all their fault. They won't give the hostages back, sexual violence, and the list continues. And it's really interesting, and you can listen here to Kamala Harris on December 7th. The language is unified amongst all of them. Hillary Clinton is even in office. Who's giving her the talking points? Kamala Harris says, we've seen horrific reports of sexual assault by Hamas on October 7th. It is reprehensible and must be condemned. Rape can never be used as a weapon of war. I've spent my career protecting women and girls from heinous crimes of sexual violence and will continue to do so. Completely unsubstantiated reports. Just because you can print something in an article does not mean that it is true or that you can kill as a result. You receive a carte blanche to bomb everyone to shreds as a result of a report. Well, let's see how committed they are to preventing rape as a weapon of war, or as a weapon at all, or what is it, she says, spent my career protecting women and girls from heinous crimes. So now she wants to protect Israeli girls from rape and heinous crimes and sexual violence. Well, Ms. Harris, how about the Times of Israel, which reports that an IDF officer charged with sexual assault of 3 female subordinates, a second lieutenant, faces 11 counts of sodomy and forcible indecent acts that he allegedly committed using his command authority. In Haaretz, a soldier kills herself after reporting she was raped. Now, Israeli army probes suspicions of negligence. Despite reporting the rape on the night it happened, the soldier was not taken to get her treatment, her complaint was not passed on, and her access to a weapon was not limited. How many times have we heard in the last 2 weeks, oh, we believe all women, except for when it's Israeli women? Again from Haaretz, 90% of rape cases in Israel closed without indictment, study finds. Report from the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel finds 40% increase in number of Israelis reporting sexual assault. Haaretz again, 3 Israeli soldiers charged with raping, sodomizing female comrade. The indictment says Air Force men filmed the assault. NBC News, at least 17 Israeli soldiers are being investigated in the statutory rape of an 11-year-old girl who lived with her family on an Air Force base in southern Israel. Meanwhile, they want me to believe, Blinken wants me to believe, and he said this, that a Hamas militant walked in, almost like a weird fairy tale, walked in on a family having breakfast, gouged out the eye of the father, ripped off the hair or something like this of the daughter, amputated the finger of the child, the son, and then, forgive me, this is utterly disgusting that it's been repeated this many times, cut off the breast of the mother, and then killed the whole group. This cut off breast is something that shows up over and over in different reports. Not substantiated reports, rumors. Even going as far as saying children were thrown in the oven and were burnt alive in the oven. There's something very interesting that people have noticed amongst the pro-Palestinian movement, and they have summarized it as such. They have said, when it comes to the Israelis, every accusation is an admission. There are testimony from those Israelis who were involved in the early Nakba of 1948, and they attest to doing these very things, including throwing a child into a kiln oven that was used for bread, and when the father cried and wept, they picked him up and they threw him into. Let us look at someone else for an instance. A non-Muslim. I don't even know if Gabor Mate believes in God. But what I do know about Gabor Mate, he is a Hungarian-Canadian physician and psychologist who has done an amazing amount of work on trauma. And he's raised, as far as I know, 2 children that are fantastically courageous towards dedicating their lives towards truth, and specifically Aaron Mate, who have taken the time as Jews, as ex-Zionists, who were sold the lie of Zionism, to educate themselves about what actually happened in Palestine, not just in 1948, but dating back to before the British Mandate. Here's what Gabor Mate, a man who is committed to morality, said in response to Benjamin Netanyahu. He says, I completely agree with Netanyahu. The light will triumph over the darkness. He's referring to the statement in which Netanyahu was saying that the light will being the light, being the Israelis, or at least the military machine that belongs to Israel, will triumph over all Palestinians, the children of darkness. He says the light will triumph over the darkness. He is just a bit confused as to what represents light and darkness. He is one of the darkest minds on the world stage right now, and he dares quote scripture. Another palm tree. I'll give him scripture. The Tanakh says, one should not oppress the stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, you who yourself were strangers in Egypt. Netanyahu has devoted his career to oppressing the other, and he dares prattle on about light. With him and with many other politicians, turn off the sound and just listen to their body language. What you're seeing there is a person so alienated from his humanity, so committed to his evil. As they say in Hungarian, whatever he says, being Netanyahu, it's so false, not even the opposite is true. Yes, Bibi, the light will triumph, despite whatever you can do, and you have lots of power to impose a lot of suffering, and you will, because that is your nature. That is what you're committed to do. Netanyahu's nature was not born evil. It was the culmination of decisions that he made. And his lack of courage to stand up to a machine of terror the way that this family had, Gabor Mate's family had. We go back to the story of Banu Nadir and the planting of the palm trees in front of their fortress. The help that they were relying on never arrived. And there's a very important reason why. The culmination of all the surahs, I believe, seem to suggest that this is the answer. The answer that Hashr talks about is the striking of doubt in the hearts. They gave heart, so to speak. They lost their will, and they gave up. And their homes or their fortress collapsed. And it was broken by their hand and by the hand of the believers. That coming apart was the realization of the power of what the Muslim polity had on its side in comparison to themselves. The comparison was, they signed a treaty, they broke the treaty. Then they made a new treaty with a new group, and the other group broke their treaty with them. They relied, they gave their word to induce reliance from the Muslims, and then they went to receive their word in hopes of being able to rely on another group of deceitful individuals. And the only thing they received in return was deceit. What was it that actually caused them to lose? What caused them the fear of doubt? What caused their hearts to go in different directions was witnessing the absolute commitment of the Muslims to a moral stance and principle. The Muslims didn't care what the standards were. They didn't take seriously, in that instance so at least, they didn't take seriously the accusations that they were the immoral group, because they had now seen Banu Nadir for who they were. They were deceitful. They lacked courage, the courage that it takes to stand up and stand by your word and stand by the principle of following through, of being trustworthy, of trying your absolute hardest to procure the best way forward. The Muslims, however, didn't need to be chided by Banu Nadir when they were in the circumstances of deciding whether or not to cut down beloved palm trees. They were way ahead of them. That accusation that was leveled was just the spin machine. That spin machine exists today for the West on the whole in the form of women's rights, democracy, international law, humanitarian pauses, humanitarian cargo, humanitarian food, the UN, the climate conference that was in Sharm el-Sheikh last year and is in Dubai this year, An absolute joke. And the worst part is the surrounding countries that could come to the aid of the Palestinians are supposedly Muslim countries who decide not to take the playbook of the early Muslims who are debating about whether or not to cut down the palm trees. No, they take the playbook of Banu Nadir. Spin, greenwash, pinkwash, blue wash. Buy soccer teams, buy players, build invisible cities in the sand, build another Kaaba, anything to distract, anything to show progress, anything to pretend, anything to show that we are committed to spinning and planting as many palm trees as possible to protect cover for our treachery and for our lack of moral principle. I want to end, but before I end, there was some very bitter news that came to anyone who has been following Palestinian voices in Gaza before this war, and indeed after, during this war. And that is the voice of Professor Rafat al-Arir. I meant to eulogize him to a degree. Obviously, I don't know him. But the pain that I felt yesterday made me feel that he was a friend. He didn't know who I was, but he was my friend. And I'm thankful to Muhammad Sulaiman, or at Gaza Subaltern, who eulogized his teacher. And I want to share with you what he said about Professor Rafat. He says, in my first class at university, Intro to English Literature, Rafat mentioned the word ideology and asked in passing if we knew what it meant. I put my hand up and I said hesitatingly, it's a way of thinking. He stood next to me. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and he said, brilliant. He says, Rafat inspired me. He made me who I am. He instilled in me the love of what can be called discursive resistance. He introduced me to Edward Said. He praised me as his most top student and continued to do so years after I graduated. Those who know me know what Rafat was to me. My parents, friends, and classmates knew how much I respected and looked up to Rafat. He taught me Shakespeare, John Donne, Wordsworth, Andrew Marvell. Rafat was a visionary. He made a community out of our cohort of male and female English language students through a private online platform called Eye on Palestine. We used to go online, write prose and poetry, engage in online banter, play games, and organize trips. Many students used to avoid Rafat's classes. They thought he was too strict and taught heavy content. He did not keep it basic. He made us read whole novels and plays, not spark notes. He taught us everything and taught us not to worry, as we didn't have to remember everything he said. Rafat was an idol to so many of us. He was our teacher. But he was more than that. He was a friend, a mentor, a guide, and so much more. He was devoted to his parents, his family, his friends, and his students, and his people. He was a special kind of fighter. I went on to become a university teacher myself. Every time my students express admiration for me, admiration for me and my teaching methods, I tell them it's because I too once had an inspirational teacher. Instantly thinking of Dr. Rafat al-Arir, Abu Omar, Gazer's writing martyr. I want to leave you with his last testimony, which was a poem that he wrote. He said, if I must die, you must live. You must live to tell my story, to sell my things, and to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, and let it be a tale. They are killing our teachers. Our teachers are our past, our present, and our future. And I feel this pain very... This is a significant death. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا. ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار يا رب. Ya Rab, I ask you to bless our teachers, to bless the soul of Rafa'at, a beloved voice, to bless his sister and their brother and their children that were killed. Give us the moral strength to cut down those palm trees that are falsely planted, and have the moral strength to water those palm trees at their roots and at their principles, that will not provide shade for anger, fear, and hate, but will provide the date and the sustenance for a moral trajectory, one so badly we need. Allow us to be children of light and to shun darkness. Allow us to put aside our egos, put aside our selfishness, and make room for God's light to shine in our hearts, so we can be remembered as heroes like Rafat. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وآل محمد وأقيموا الصلاة